China is troubled and creating ripple effects across the world as it grapples with a host of existential pressures. But there's one unfolding factor that's dangerously underappreciated, so important to China's future that it could lead to war.
Those irritants, I don't see them provoking a military response. This semiconductor scenario starts to look like something that might cross that line.
China is suddenly in the headlines a lot these days, and for good reason. Big developments are underway there that will have big repercussions on global trade, financial markets, supply chains, and geopolitical stability. To give us a sense of just how big, we welcome George Calhoun to the program. George is a teaching professor at the Stephen Institute for Technology's School of Business, with decades of experience in the high-tech industry and capital markets financing. He just had an article appear in Forbes focusing on the acute tension brewing within China, particularly in one essential area that's dangerously underappreciated by the media at the moment. And I've asked him to help us better understand exactly what's going on. George, thank you so much for joining us today, and on short notice too.
Yeah, thank you. Fun to be here.
Thanks. Well, look, before we get to the crux of your recent Forbes article, can you just give us a high-level summary of the big challenge that China's grappling with today, like demographics, resources, public health, its economy, et cetera?
Okay, well, books and books are written on that. So a quick overview. I guess I would say that the big picture is that China is trying to do in one generation what the Western world, the Western economies in the United States took 2 centuries to accomplish, to move from a rural agrarian economy to a high-tech industrial, post-industrial economy. And to do that in such a short period of time is bound to throw a lot of things out of joint along the way. And so, I think the best perspective overall to take on China is kind of a patient one, and expect that it's going to take them some fits and starts to make the different pieces of their transition work. And I think, maybe not to overreact to any of the specific ins and outs of the policy at the moment. And nevertheless, it is such an important transition for China and for the global economy that I think we have a right to be critical and be concerned about some of the things that may be developing there. There's a demographic dimension, of course. There is a political dimension, the resurgence, let's call it, of a more authoritarian model in the Chinese regulatory regime. And there's a technology dimension. I mean, the Chinese tech sector 20 years ago, when I was in the industry, in the wireless industry, China's presence was almost not really there yet. Strange to say, in the year 2000, in the wireless world, which is the one that I knew, China was not yet really a player. Today, they're a dominant player, and it's amazing how far they've come and how quickly they've come up that curve in a lot of the areas of technology. But it is an irregular process, and not all of the aspects of their engine are working in full harmony yet, I think, with the goals that they're trying to achieve.
All right, thanks. And I probably understand China about as well as the average American, which is not really all that much, which is one reason why I've asked you to come on here. But the challenges I know they are grappling with, they have an aging population with the demographic challenge you mentioned there, right? With the one-child policy having been in place for so long, they now have a very they've got an awful lot of old people or aging people and fewer younger people to support them. And that's just going to create issues on its own. They also have one of the largest populations in the world, but they're in a country that doesn't have sufficient resources in a lot of different critical areas for the type of population they have, water being an extremely good example of that. You know, on the public health side, that was the epicenter of the COVID outbreak and whatnot. And I must assume, and I look to you to provide context here, but I must assume that, you know, given its history of governance, but given how many people there are and a lot of those challenges I just mentioned, the natural, you mentioned there's sort of a tightening of control there, authoritarian control. I imagine that's sort of just sort of the natural way in which we would expect China to react to a lot of these big challenges. Is it's got to force a lot of people to get in line in order to be able to, you know, try to keep some of these problems as manageable as possible. Is that a fair assumption?
Well, and I think it is, and I think that there's also a question of coming to terms with the mindset of a tech economy. Technology is a disruptive force. It unsettles established arrangements in every sector, really, and that's not something that is congenial, I think, for the regime in China. They like to be in control. And so they're dealing with, they would like to become a technological power in the world. They would like to have global influence in technology and to some degree control. But to allow that process to take the course that it wants to take is going to mean unsettling a lot of the arrangements and threatening some of the established order there. And that's the dialectic that's going on, I think, the tension that's going on. And you had a period of time, probably up until just a few years ago, where there was a lot of encouragement. Deng Xiaoping said, it's great to get rich, let's go get rich, and then worry about the rest of it. Now it's the flow has come back the other way, and there's a lot of concern, in many ways valid concern, about inequalities of income, about the demographic challenges in China, but it's blended with this also authoritarian mindset that just is somewhat allergic to the nature of a disruptive technological economy. And that's the tension that I think domestically the Chinese are struggling with, and how we play into that and how our technological interface to that system plays out is what I've been trying to look at. I don't portray myself as an expert on domestic Chinese culture or politics, but I know something about the American tech system and the way that it wants to interface and needs to interface with the Chinese system. And some of the risks that crop up from that are what I've been focusing on in my recent columns.
All right, well, let's get to your recent column there, because you basically just set a good context for how China is really trying to hold as many strings as it can, as tightly as it can, to control things, but it has this, just by its very nature, this disruptive force of technology it's trying to control, and you know, America being a very important player in that process as well adds additional complexity to it. But basically, there's this grenade that's just gone off in the space, and that is the shortage of supply in the semiconductor industry. Can you tell us why that is so important to China right now?
Well, semiconductors are as it's been said, the oil of the 21st century. It's the resource that you need to run a tech economy. A digital economy is almost everything is going to come back to the ability to create integrated circuits that make the products work, that make the communications in the networks function. And so it's a crucial resource in 21st century, just as oil was in the 20th century or coal in the 19th century. And China, as it turns out, is not really very well positioned in the semiconductor industry today. They do not have a strong presence. The industry is divided into a number of different important segments. There is the set of designers, chip designers that design the functionality that goes into these products. That's pretty much completely dominated by the US industry today. China has very little presence in that. It's called the fabless sector of the IC world, the integrated circuit world. The designs are then taken to another segment of the industry, which are typically called the foundries that actually physically manufacture the chips. And once again, China has a very limited presence in that segment. And perhaps ironically, the dominant presence in that segment is Taiwan. The Taiwanese foundry industry is something like 2/3 of the capacity of the world capacity there. So the way that the industry works today is the designers, this is Qualcomm and NVIDIA and Broadcom and Xilinx and dozens of very successful, mostly American companies, take their designs to Taiwan, and that's where the manufacturing of the chips is done, and it's a very productive symbiosis. Poor China, mainland China, is kind of not in that, they're not in that loop. They don't have a domestic strength in either side of that industry. And yet they manufacture many, many products, including iPhones and all sorts of other electronic products where this is a crucial input. The chips that come from this symbiotic relationship between the US and Taiwan are a critical resource for the Chinese industry. And they buy, the figure I saw in Bloomberg was $350 billion a year of these chips. And 90% of those chips come from the US or from US-owned companies, US-controlled companies. So they have to be feeling a vulnerability about this. And the article that I wrote, I started out as a kind of, you might almost say a fanciful historical exercise to look at the parallels between the Japanese in just prior to World War II were in a position where they were dependent upon a critical resource, oil at the time, that they did not control. And the US was in a position to squeeze the pipeline on them. And it was that dynamic, most people would say, that was one of the major contributors to Japan's decision to go on the offensive and really, and it led to Pearl Harbor, among many other things, in 1941, 1942. And what I drew as a parallel in the Forbes piece was the vulnerability that mainland China has today in their mind, I think, and in reality, to a critical resource, the integrated circuits, the semiconductor business, that their economy and their military depend upon, that they don't control. And if I'm putting my mind in the mind, if I'm stepping into the shoes of maybe some of the thinkers in China about how they might solve this, well, there are two ways to solve it. One is they can grow their own industry. And without going into detail, I'll just summarize by saying they have not been very successful at that. And there are possibly good reasons why that's not the kind of thing that they're going to be very successful at with a top-down governmental approach. This is not putting a man on, this is not putting a Mars lander on Mars or a man on the moon. Those are the kinds of things that a heavy government hand can go out and force it to happen, perhaps. But building the semiconductor industry with the technology, the market orientation, they have not been successful with that. So their other option at some point might be to try to acquire a more direct control of the source. And since the source sits right there in Taiwan, and that then connects to the multi-decade political nexus of the mainland China versus Taiwan and all the claims there. That's what I drew that parallel, and end it with a question mark, whether or not that's going to tip China into a military move of some kind. I think there's a lot of tension in the system, in the global interaction between the West and China today. But I don't see military outcomes from our concerns about human rights in Central Asia. I don't see, cybercrime, intellectual property theft, the wolf warrior syndrome. There are a lot of irritating factors in the relationship, and probably from our side as well. Audit standards in New York of companies listed in New York. There are a lot of irritants in the system, but those irritants, I don't see them provoking a military response. This semiconductor scenario starts to look like something that might cross that line. And that was the thrust of my sort of suggestive historical parallel between Japan in 1941 and China today.
All right, thanks. And I just want to sort of hammer this home for folks. So, what you're saying is, look, there's lots of tensions between the US and China, just between, like there are between any great nations, none of which seems to be really worth going to war over, unless you say China got so desperate here that it decided it needed to basically annex Taiwan forcibly to be able to get control in the semiconductor space that it is so highly dependent upon right now and for its future, correct?
Well, and consider the fact that in the last year or two or three, for let's say a parallel set of reasons in a way, the U.S. has decided to crack down on one of the major Chinese champion companies, Huawei, in the wireless world that I used to be a part of, and they've really crippled Huawei. They have been able to deny them access to U.S. semiconductor design and U.S. semiconductor manufacturing, and I think it has definitely impacted Huawei's standing in the world and their market share, and it's a demonstration of what can happen if the West and if the United States, for policy reasons, decides that they want to pinch that pipeline. They can really do some serious harm. And that's the other aspect of what I think must be in the heads of some of the folks in China these days. They're realizing they have a vulnerability. It's not a hypothetical vulnerability. They can look at the Huawei case and see a clear demonstration of the exercise of this power.
All right, so let me ask you this, George, then. So China is aware of how really incredibly dependent they are on these semiconductors. The products they manufacture just don't work without them. Their military is dependent upon them. The US has already, as you're saying, sort of weaponized the semiconductor by withholding it from a key company there in the state, doing what you've said is real material damage to it. And then COVID disrupted the supply chain of the semiconductor industry. And, we here in the West, we see, the shortage and all sorts of things. Car prices have just exploded because there's tons of cars that have been built, but are sitting there in parking lots, new cars, because they don't have the chips in them that they need to actually function, right? And that's rippling across the world. I'm sure China is feeling this semiconductor dependency even more acutely because of this supply chain disruption. So I guess first question for you is, what's your general estimate of how long it will take before the shortages in the semiconductor supply chain begin to equilibrate? And could that ratchet sort of the tension, this pinch point down if semiconductors get back to flowing sort of the way they were before COVID? Or do you think that we're in a kind of a new world era here where China's going to increasingly have to fight hard for that semiconductor supply?
Well, one of the difficulties of this industry is it's not easy to add capacity. It's not quick to add capacity in the semiconductor business. Everybody's familiar with Moore's law, which refers to how the technology progresses and gets cheaper and better over time. There's a corresponding law that has also been identified, which basically goes the other way and says the cost of a new fabrication facility in semiconductors is going to double every several years. And you're up to a situation today where if you want to build a new plant, it's going to take a few years to do it. It's going to cost more than the cost of a nuclear power plant or an aircraft carrier. We're talking, let's say, anywhere from $7 to $20 billion. And the plant is going to have an effective lifetime of maybe 5 years. And you need at least 2 of them because you're going to have capacity issues to be managed. So Intel and Samsung and Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corp, which are the 3 big foundry players in the world today, each of them has announced $100 billion in the range of $100 billion, $300 billion altogether of projected investment in the coming years to stay in front of the capacity demand that they see coming. And that money, just the scope of that investment tells you this is not something they're going to go out and adjust and solve within a 3 to 6 month time frame. This is about breaking ground, literally breaking ground in new fields, new areas to build massive new fabrication facilities. Mm-hmm. So I guess my answer, not again that I'm not it's not my expertise to track the market professionally in detail, but what I know about the technology here tells me that it's going to be a while that we're going to have this constraint. And at the same time, it's not just the constraint of the supply chains being disrupted by the pandemic. It's the constraint of the demand surge in the West. Our economy this year is going to grow 8%, something like that. This is we're in a demand crisis, so to speak, in the positive sense. The demand for these products is growing faster. The automotive, I just saw the compound annual growth rate of automotive, the use of automotive chips is something like 15% a year at this point. This is going to put stress on the whole system for a number of years, I would project. And that stress is going to be felt by everybody, but it's going to add to this geopolitical stress that we've just been talking about in terms of China's vulnerability and their assessment of how they might deal with it.
All right. Well, this was the main reason why I wanted to have you on, George, was just to help people really become aware that, most wars have always been wars of resource. Certainly for the past 100 years, oil has sort of been the dominant driver of a lot of geopolitical conflict. You even just mentioned why it was a driving force for Japan entering World War II. And that semiconductors, likely may need to be added to the list going forward of what drives military conflict. All right. Well, look, China has some other issues that we didn't talk about as well. And I don't want to keep you on to go in depth into them because I don't know if they're really in as much your area of expertise. But this week we've been seeing lots of headlines of the failure of a large property developing and lending company there called Evergrande. And a lot of people are calling this potentially China's Lehman moment, obviously referring back to the failure of Lehman Brothers, which sort of kicked off the 2008 global financial crisis. We just talked about sort of the tensions and the pain that China's feeling over the shortage in semiconductors here. And then if it ends up having a, economic or I don't want to say collapse, but maybe cascade there in its financial system coming after this Evergrande bankruptcy, which it looks like it's entering into. Does that sort of ratchet up the pressure on China to the point where it potentially may need to take more drastic steps, in response to whatever economics pain it's feeling, that it may feel like that's the trigger that it needs to then just take a bold step, like potentially going after Taiwan? I mean, is that a worry of yours in terms of how well you know China, or do you think that that'll be a little bit more contained?
Well, the financial system in China is also going through its process of trying to compress. You just think of all the history in the U.S. going from, the crises in the early part of the 1900s through the formation of the Federal Reserve, the Great Depression, all that, figuring out how the system works, and we're still figuring out how the system works. And China is trying to compress all of that in an incredibly short time to create a financial system that can be on a par with the West. And they're going to go through these kinds of crises. Evergrande is going to be, I guess, the largest bankruptcy that China has seen. They're not the only ones. They bailed out just about a month ago another very large financial company called Huarong, which I think they did the right thing to bail it out, but they have the same challenges that our regulators had. Do we bail out Bear Stearns? Do we let Lehman Brothers go under? Do we then come back and bolster the remaining entities in the financial system because we're concerned about systemic risk? And there aren't necessarily right answers to all of that, or at least not consistent answers that you can apply in a mechanical way. And China is going through, the Chinese regulators are going through the process of figuring out how they're going to manage a modern financial system. And the financial system is a high-tech system. I mean, that's what they're also, I think, coming to see with their approaches to Alibaba, to Ant, the Ant Group, Jack Ma's empire, which is now being disassembled piece by piece, it appears. So they're not going to get they won't have any easy time of it in the financial dimension either. I think that's going to add to the pressure. Whether that interacts directly with their military thinking, I'm going to defer that to a true military expert, which I'm not. But it's going to be
those added pressures aren't going to help. Basically, is what you're saying.
It's not going to help. It's going to be a rough patch for China. The climate is changing over there, and the economic climate, and I think. We're going to see a lot of stress in China. I would even say I think the regime there may feel under some kind of threat in the coming period of time, because they're making a lot of what would look like, and what I will call at least, they're making a lot of blunders. Their moves in Hong Kong, they're undercutting what could have been a tremendous. Hong Kong was one of the leading financial centers of the world, and I don't think it's going to be that in the future because of the steps that they're taking. And they're creating problems that are going to pinch their policy space pretty tight, I think. They're now trying to rein in the tech companies, and what you're seeing is a lot of pullback of the innovators and tech entrepreneurs stepping aside from their lead roles, stepping down as CEO or as chairman, and they know what's, they see the demonstration effect of things like stopping the Ant Group's IPO last fall, or coming in 2 days after Didi went public in New York very successfully, and basically cutting their legs out. They're not allowed to acquire new customers all of a sudden. All their apps have been pulled from the mobile stores. They're under a barrage of regulatory constraints all of a sudden, and their stock is down 50%. And the tech sector in China has followed them right down. So there's, you have to wonder at some point whether or not there will be questions within the Chinese government about the wisdom of some of the steps that they're taking in these areas, and whether there is a battle that goes on for who's going to be the one that is driving the ship. We'll have to see, but I think it is going to get rough.
All right, so lots of uncertainty and rougher times ahead in your prediction. All right, so as we wind things down here, George, two last questions for you. First is how concerned are you about the current situation there? Is this just the growing pains of a country that's accelerating its transition from a developing to a developed nation, and there's just going to always be bumps along the way? Or is this something that you feel portends, like you wrote about at World War II, one of those moments in time where a country sort of comes to an existential juncture where it needs to make, big, bold, and maybe desperate decisions?
I think it could well be the latter case here, is that, this is, if you follow the trajectory of their rhetoric and of the symbolic statements that they're making about, putting people on notice that they can't use the word Taiwan anymore in describing certain types of offices or connections to the government, to the country there, the Taiwanese, you're not, I think it begins to look like there's an element of, what would I want to say, hysteria, anxiety, an irrational component coming into what might have been previously sort of a very structural, okay, we claim Taiwan, but we're going to let it sort of be in limbo, and we're not going to make a big issue out of it. They seem to be moving across that line a lot now in the rhetorical space and the political space to make clear that they're viewing this as a significant issue, and that's worrisome. And when I connected this to the semiconductor economics and politics that we've been talking about, I guess it made me a little bit more anxious than I was when I started out thinking about it. Definitely.
Okay. And what will you be watching most closely as things unfold from here?
With respect to the semiconductor argument in particular, you're asking, or?
Sure, but I'm just thinking sort of in general, like, if you're afraid that this is going to kind of reach a boiling point at some point, just what elements or what areas of China and its policy decisions are you going to be watching most closely?
Well, there's a Chinese expression, as I understand it, which is translated as kill chicken, scare monkey. And the idea is that you make a demonstration, a very perhaps rough and brutal demonstration, to show the larger audience that they need to change their behavior. And if that's what's going on, I think that's probably less worrisome. In other words, if they're making an example, however rough, of Jack Ma or of Didi, and the rest of the Chinese economic and tech community takes note and responds in the way that they want them to, I think the tensions may die down. and go back to more of a normal authoritarian relationship, but where there's still latitude for entrepreneurs to develop and progress and move forward, and maybe the tensions will go down. So I guess I would be watching to see what happens in the next few months. Are these measures going to be ratcheted up? Are they going to, or are we going to see a withdrawal of some of the more severe? Is Didi going to be approved now to go back to business? Is the Ant Group going to be allowed to do its public offering? Okay, they've been rectified, they've been restructured. Are we going to let them go public now and go back to some kind of status quo with the appropriate changes in place? Or is it really a case that winter is coming and the tech world is going to be not favored the way they were under the previous, in let's say the past 20 years, but is going to start to face a serious regulatory headwind that may make it impossible for China to continue their upward path in the tech world. And that's going to, that's going to be, if they can't solve their problems through internal technological development, they're going to look for the military answer.
That's where the risk goes on, right? Okay, so I guess we'll watch closely to see if they just end with the chickens, or if they start progressively killing, more and more bigger animals.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, look, George, thank you so much. And again, thank you so much for dropping everything you did when I called you to have this discussion. I think it's super fascinating. And I think it's just sort of a vector that most of us really haven't been looking that closely at and didn't realize how strategically important it was. So anyways, if folks have enjoyed this conversation and they would like to learn more about you, follow you and your work, where can they go?
Well, I work at a university today called Stevens Institute of Technology. It's here in Hoboken, New Jersey, right on the west bank of the Hudson River. And I run a whole bunch of finance-related programs, financial, fintech research, and that kind of thing. So you can Google that. I also more or less weekly write this column at Forbes online, and you can find that, again, Google my name and Forbes, and you'll get to that. China is one of the topics I follow, but I do a lot of finance related topics as well. So anyhow, and I'm wide open. Anyone that wants to email me or reach out, that's cool too. I'm trying to be pretty responsive.
All right. Well, you're a bold man and you were very responsive to me when I reached out. So thank you so much. George, really appreciate you coming on. Fascinating discussion. Look forward to having you on the program again. And again, just thank you so much for your time and your insights.
Well, thank you. It has been fun. That was your test, I think. And so I'll say we passed.
Okay, good, great. Well, thanks so much, George.
All right.
We hope you've enjoyed this exploration with tech and finance professor George Calhoun. I was grateful George had come on the program on such short notice, as the challenges China faces that he and I discussed here build nicely on the interview I recently recorded with legendary investor Jim Rogers, which will be released on this channel this coming Friday. And if you'd like to see more interviews like this one with George, where we pull in a domain expert on short notice to make sense of important yet underappreciated developments unfolding in world events, let me know in the comments section below, and we'll make more of them going forward. And if you haven't already, don't forget to support this channel by first liking this video and then clicking on the red subscribe button below, as well as that little bell icon right next to it. These two steps may seem tiny, but they really do help us out if everyone watching this video does them together. Thanks for watching.